this up. Ba, 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 ba. All right. So I put the paper topic up on Blackboard. I should have, unless I missed this class somehow. And again, if you guys need to send it to me via email, please do so as like an attached Word or PDF document. If you have to do it with a Google Doc, don't send me the link, like attach it as a file. I don't use Google Docs, so I don't know how that works, but like most of the time when people send me links, it makes me send a thing back to you to get permission for it, and by the time you guys get back to me, I'm like 5 papers down. So however you send it to me, make sure I can open it immediately, that there's no back and forth. Again, that's not due until like the end of October, so there's no rush on that, but I did have some people asking me about it, so I figured I'd go ahead and put it up there. Any questions before we start? I also had some people email me about the test, which again isn't happening until we finish Chapter 3. We are about halfway through Chapter 2, so we're still a little ways out on that. We'll see how much we get done today. But I mean, absolute earliest, like next Wednesday, but I don't see that happening. That would assume we finish this today, get like halfway through Chapter 3 today, and then finish Chapter 3 on Monday. I don't see that happening. So yeah, you don't need to worry about it for a little while longer yet. And again, I do have a study guide that I'll be putting on Blackboard as we get into Chapter 3, so you don't need to worry about it being like a sudden surprise. Okay, so nothing from you guys before we start? I mean, I know it's 8:30. It's early on a Wednesday. Yes?
For the problems that you want to send to us, when it says paper topic 1, that's the first paper?
Yes.
And the paper topic 2, that's the second paper?
Yes.
So they're both in there?
Oh yeah, those are both papers, yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, I did put them together, didn't I? I used to have them separate, and then I just put them together. So yeah, both paper topics are on there. I forgot I'd done that. So the first one, paper topic 1, is the one that's due in October, at the end of October, and the second one's due at the end of the semester, which is technically like a month later because of how our breaks go. Because we have Thanksgiving break, and then after that we have 1 day of class, which is really just going to be our review day. And rather than have like an entire week between when my Tuesday, Thursday class will have theirs due and you guys will have yours due, both of the classes, well, I guess all the classes, including the online classes, just get them to me before Thanksgiving break, which is like the end of November. I've got the dates on the thing online. So yes, thank you for mentioning that. Both topics are on the thing on Blackboard, which again, those are just the default topics. If you want to do something besides that, as I mentioned in the on the document, you can do anything between like the beginning of the book to before the Revolutionary War, because the second one is more focused on the Revolutionary War, but you can also do anything from that point until like really the Civil War. So feel free to go beyond that if there's something you specifically want to write on.
So between the 2 papers and the 3 tests and the final exam, there's nothing else we're doing in class?
Correct.
No pop quizzes?
No pop quizzes. No, that's extra crap, and I don't deal with that. No, we don't do that. I mean, there is extra credit, but that's all on the tests. That's just extra stuff to see how much you guys have been paying attention. But that's just, that's all on the test. You guys don't need to worry about me suddenly handing things out yeah. And again, everything on the test is going to be things we discussed in class. I mean, like I mentioned with the Magellan thing, occasionally it'll be a video. But I'm not going to ask you like really detailed stuff from videos. It'll be, general topics. But yeah. Anything else? Good questions from you guys. Again, I've done this so many times, sometimes I forget details that you guys might not know. Okay, so again, if you want to do something besides the default topic, let me know so I can make sure you're not trying to do something overly broad. More so for the second one, since we're around the Revolutionary War, like people were like, oh, I want to do a biography of George Washington. That's way too broad. That's way too broad. You could do like what he did during the Revolutionary War, but even that, there's a lot there. So like with this first one, if you wanted to do, say, Queen Elizabeth, because she was important in America's, the colony's founding and whatnot. You could do like her involvement with, the Spanish Armada and how it affected the colonization of the U.S., or the colonization of North America, but you don't want to do a full-on like biography of Queen Elizabeth I because she's got a lot going on. So you want to keep things a little bit focused because again, it's 2 to 3 pages, double space. That's not a lot of room to try to go into detail on some of these things. Okay, and again, just make sure you cite your stuff so that I know where you're getting your stuff from. Because if it looks like you've copied and pasted it from an article, I will find it, and you won't get a good grade. Okay. Again, that's like a month and a half out, so don't worry too much about that. All right, images from all this going on, Jamestown, the Powhatan Confederacy. Okay, so I will ask you guys a question before we get to the next slide. So, as we've seen so far, the European powers coming to North America have done their best to make money. For the Spanish, it was really easy. They just came in and, stole native gold. And the French traded with Native Americans largely for furs because that was a big ticket item in Europe at the time. How did the English make money in Jamestown? What did they do to make a profit? Or what was the one big thing that was their moneymaker? No, that was more the French. The English, especially in Jamestown, their trading with the natives was mostly a thing of survival.
Did they start planting?
They started planting. Do you know what it was?
Sugar?
It wasn't sugar.
Oh, did they tax it?
Hmm?
Did they tax it?
No, it wasn't taxing.
Was it a cash crop?
There was a specific cash crop. Not yet. That comes later. Rice is more in South Carolina. We're getting there. It is a cash crop. It made them a lot of money.
It's not cotton.
It's not cotton. That's later.
I'll give it later.
Tobacco. And as we'll talk about in 102 next semester, like that continued to be a major cash crop throughout periods of history. Like that's why everything in North Carolina is named after the Duke family. It was this like massive cigar empire, and it made all of the money ever. Yeah, so that was a thing. So yeah, military aggression against the natives wouldn't be enough to save Virginia Colony, which was, the expansion of Jamestown, because again, there was no gold to steal. So Orinoco tobacco, which is this short-leaf tobacco, I'll show you guys in a minute what it looks like, was being grown in, let me make sure that I just want to make sure my sound, okay, good. That was being grown in the West Indies and South America, was becoming very popular in Europe. And so John Rolfe was like, hey, it's humid and grows here in Virginia. Maybe we can grow tobacco here as well. So started experimenting with it in 1612, and within 2 years, it was growing really, really well. Again, if you drive through the countryside, I mean, even here in South Carolina, and you pass by fields, during the late spring, early summer, you'll often see just fields of tobacco. So production quickly began to increase, and so investment and labor being sent to Jamestown also increased. So not only were they making money, but investment being sent into Jamestown and making it grow also increased, which meant that Jamestown was now becoming a more stable settlement. So you don't need to know these numbers or the years or any of this, but this is just showing how quickly this grew. So by 1615, which is the year after they realized, hey, this is going to make us money, they shipped about a ton of tobacco back to England, which, over the course of a year isn't that much, but that's where we're starting. Within 5 years, it had gone up to 40,000 pounds, and before 1630, it was up to 1.5 million pounds. So very, very quickly it grew from just like, hey, this is something that could maybe make us some money, to this is the only thing we're doing. Which will gradually become an issue, but we'll get to that later. Now, this is going to cause some issues, because in order to grow crops, you need land to grow the crops on. Well, the natives, again, land ownership wasn't really a thing with the natives, but when you're just like taking land they're living on and using it to grow European stuff, you are essentially taking their land. So, there was now more friction between the English and the natives. 1614, Powhatan attempted to broker one final alliance between his people and the English by marrying his daughter Pocahontas to John Rolfe. She converted to Christianity, took the name Rebecca, traveled with him back to England with their infant son, but died by 1617 because England's an awful place to live. The English just showing up in North America is enough to make the natives die. Bringing a native back to England is just like, here, have this soup of disease. English die in England from disease because England's an awful place. So after she died, John Rolfe returned to England to Virginia to continue working on tobacco cultivation. And around this time, Powhatan died, leaving his brother Opachanacah? Channa? I don't know. His brother was chief, and his brother was far less interested in brokering peace with the Europeans. He didn't want them there, which, to be fair, yeah. So here we have picking tobacco. Again, if you've ever seen tobacco fields, you know what this looks like. These big, broad, shiny leaves. Although, this is a later image because of the way the tobacco looks. This was actually what the tobacco looked like in Jamestown. This is much smaller tobacco, much less yield, but that's what they had at the time. Don't even get me started on what banana juice looked like. They were like these little tiny berry things, and human cultivation turned them into something completely different. But, human cultivation being what it is. And then, you hang the tobacco up and let it cure before you roll it and send it off to be manufactured into whatever they manufactured into, cigarettes, chewing tobacco, etc. Or just ground into, like cigar, not cigar, pipe tobacco, where you just stuff it in the pipe. So here we have the marriage of Pocahontas, before she, went off to England and died. And then here we have Powhatan's brother, who was not having any of it. All right. So tobacco is working for making Virginia money, but it's causing more strain with the natives because obviously. So 1619, the Crown granted Virginia the right to establish her own local governing body, the House of Burgesses, which is important for later political growth within the colonies due to, again, it takes a month to get there and a month to get back, so it was really hard for England to micromanage the colonies. So essentially, Virginia had a form of self-government. Excuse me. They were still under the authority of the crown, but at least in local matters, they had their own, not parliament, but like local council. It's like a town council compared to, the state government. Meanwhile, colonists were pouring in, but many were too poor to pay their way, so they did the indentured servitude thing, where, again, they would essentially be enslaved for several years, and then after paying off their debt through labor, they would be given a plot of land and tools, etc., to essentially start their own little farm. And this was also the year that the first boatload of 20 Africans arrived aboard a Dutch ship. They were, however, bound as indentured servants. They weren't explicitly brought as slave labor. And this was how it was for a little while. We'll see the turn in a little bit. So we're getting more laborers for the farms because, again, tobacco needs two things, land and labor. But as we get more labor, we need more land, and as we're getting more land, Chief Opechancanough is getting pissed off. In March of 1622, he organized a surprise attack, killing a third of the population of the English settlers, which isn't nothing. I mean, that was pretty significant. Of course, the English retaliated, claiming victory by right of war. Is how it was spelled in the documentation back then. The hostilities continued for nearly a decade. Boy, that sounds like something that happened here in the U.S. a decade or so back. Well, not even a decade now. 2 decades. Jesus, I'm old. It's like, oh yeah, mission accomplished. We're going to have our big press conference on this aircraft carrier, and everything's done, but we're going to continue the war for another 20 years. Due to this ongoing conflict, King James annulled the charter, made Virginia a royal colony, and had a privy council pass laws, pay taxes directly to the Church of England, etc., etc. So Virginia became a royal colony, which meant it was now more directly under the control of the crown. So the House of Burgesses was still sort of there, but the Privy Council was more in control. They had this more direct oversight from royal authority. And again, the Church of England would often handle the taxes because the Church of England was just like an arm of the English government. It wasn't like a separate thing. The idea of separation of church and state didn't really exist because the church was just part of the state. 1644, there was another native uprising. 500 English colonists were killed. 2 years later, the chief was captured and killed. And by this point, the natives saw that there were too many Englishmen to simply kick out. So finally, the natives in the Chesapeake region submitted to the English authority and had to pay tribute to remain on the land that they had been on for generations because, well, that's how the English tend to do things. Just look at Irish history at any point. The English like to come in and tell you need to pay rent for the land you've lived on for the last several hundred, if not thousands of years. I mean, I say Irish history, it's more due to personal bias, but I mean, anywhere in the world that the English have shown up, hey, you have to pay money to live here. We've always lived here. Well, we're in charge now. So here we have the Dutch bringing in the African indentured servants, which again was essentially slavery, just with a time limit. Here we have this first attack by the Powhatan natives. This is one of the weird images. When you have a broad, like, tableau going on here, you often, if you look at it long enough, start to see weird details. Like, I mean, you of course have people getting shanked or thrown on the ground, etc. I don't know what's going on up here, but you've got, like, these people getting thrown off this table, getting stabbed. This guy's about to get a face full of knife. This guy's just, like, cutting wood, not even paying attention as he's about to get a knife in the ear. Like, I don't know what's going on here. And it's not like this is a background image. This isn't some small, like, he's barely there, some stick figure. This is the biggest, these are the biggest two characters in the image. And someone mentioned in my other class, well, maybe he's reaching for the axe. The way he's standing, it's like he's cutting wood. So I don't know. That's not at all important. It's just something I noticed and thought it was weird. Anyway, here's Virginia again. Again, from the east down this way. So you come in, you got the Chesapeake Bay and the various rivers, and you can see how detailed it is now compared to the one before where it was just like, nah, there's sea monsters out here and woods up here. Okay. So, Jamestown began to expand, and we had the growing pains of that. So the Virginia colony rapidly growing, 40,000, 50,000 new immigrants showing up to Virginia and Maryland. Maryland being an interesting case. Founded in 1632 by Charles Calvert, given the title Lord Baltimore by King Charles I. He was an interesting guy. He was somehow an English noble, but also was Catholic, which again, England was a Protestant nation, and being Catholic was usually enough to get you thrown in jail, if not just outright hung in the streets. But I guess he had enough pull with the royal family that he was allowed to essentially be exiled to North America and have his own little colony, which was all well and good. They began with St. Mary's City, built on the mouth of the Potomac. Again, Maryland, St. Mary's City, they're Catholic, man. They're all about Mary. Headed by a Catholic aristocracy. However, most of the population was Protestant laborers because, again, if they're coming from England, they're going to be Protestant. And you need people working, and most of, again, if you're getting them from England, they're going to be Protestant. So rather than have an uprising, because, I mean, that's how you get an uprising, is you have a small minority running everything, and then everybody else is essentially being oppressed. That tends to not last very long. So the governor, who was Calvert's brother, Leonard, again, there's no such thing as nepotism in aristocracy. They passed the Act of Religious Toleration, which allowed for religious freedom to all Christians, which was all well and good. So Maryland didn't suddenly catch on fire like as soon as they got started. They realized pretty early on that they should not oppress the Protestants. So that's all well and good. And Maryland also made their money the same way Virginia did, which is to say tobacco. Most of the laborers were English or Irish servants, or English-Irish laborers brought in as indentured servants, with an increasing number of African indentured servants to supplement them because they were starting to get less and less English and Irish. However, by 1660, things were actually, I guess, getting better in England. So fewer English settlers were willing to cross the Atlantic because, again, crossing the Atlantic kind of sucked. Even when you weren't stuffed in the bottom of the ship, as we're going to see a little bit later when we really get into the slave trade, there was like a 50-50 chance of you dying of disease just being on the ship. That's why, as we're also going to see a little bit later, most people sailing in the Royal Navy were forced into it. There was a much higher chance of you just dying from disease on the ship than actually ever getting into battle and dying of, like, getting hit by a cannonball. So, the Virginia House of Burgesses passed a law that allowed for African laborers to be enslaved, with Maryland following in 1664. So, in order to make up for the fact that we weren't getting as many English laborers, we're just going to straight up enslave the African laborers, just make it so they can't run out their clock on the indentured servitude thing. Now, this wasn't an arbitrary decision. I mean, it felt arbitrary. But they were actually following an example set down in Barbados. So Barbados had been growing sugar for a long time, and that was an extremely harsh and labor-intensive process, which tended to kill laborers outright. So obviously, you didn't have a lot of English laborers working there. They had lots of slaves. And due to it killing the slaves outright, they would be constantly bringing in more to supplement the numbers. So due to this, the slaves in Barbados were treated as chattel, which is to say property. They were treated like livestock, as opposed to servants, um, like they had been treated in North America previously. So Virginia and Maryland just took this process from Barbados and applied it to their labor system. The difference being, for the most part, working tobacco and, as we're going to see later, other crops tended to not kill the laborers outright. I mean, there was plenty of working people to death, but it wasn't like 80% mortality rates. So as we're going to see in North America, the slave populations were typically able to like reproduce, which wasn't the case in the Caribbean and South America. So we have Maryland, and I guess this is Leonard, because this one was Charles Calvert. This is all I could find for St. Mary's City. I guess this is like St. Mary's Church in Maryland. And then here, of course, we have, well, because you've got melanin, we're now slaves. Great work, Englishmen. And this is a later image because, I mean, obviously it's a photograph, but just to further emphasize that they were indeed people. But we'll get to that later. Now, there was another incident around the same time that further incentivized the authority of the day to make the African laborers slaves and keep the white laborers as like indentured servants and allow them some level of freedom after, you know, a certain period of time. And that was Bacon's Rebellion. So, at the start of this whole switch over to African slavery, there was still a level of class solidarity between African and European laborers, rather, because everyone was being mistreated. You know, I kept saying that, well, technically, indentured servitude isn't slavery; it's just slavery with a time limit. A lot of the time, well, I shouldn't say a lot of time. Sometimes, with uncomfortable frequency, when an indentured servant would be getting near the end of their like contract period, either their whoever was holding the contract would find some way to extend it, or force them to work to such an extent that they would just die. You'd be like, oh, well, I guess I don't have to give them a plot of land and tools and money and stuff. Oh, well, they're dead. So, yeah, while, again, indentured servitude did have a time limit, oftentimes they were treated just as bad as straight-up slaves, because at the end of the day, they were essentially free labor, and if you could kill them before their time was up, oops, you don't have to pay them now. And even if you did survive your time as an indentured servant, you weren't given like a plantation and a manor and lots of land and horses and cows and fields of tobacco. You were given like a little plot of land and some beat up rusty old tools and enough money to like maybe buy a cow. You were left at the bottom of the ladder, and many would go west to start a new life. And again, when I say going west at this point in time, I mean like a few miles inland. not even as far inland as we are here. If we're talking about South Carolina, like, just, you can still smell the ocean inland. And oftentimes they would deal with hostile natives because, well, the natives are pissed from all this other stuff that's been going on. And the government back east wouldn't want to deal with it because they're dealing with other stuff. And they certainly don't care about these former indentured servants that are going out west and getting themselves killed. So, this was the setting where Bacon's rebellion began. Nathaniel Bacon was one such former indentured servant. Let's see, what is it? He did actually come from a wealthy family, but he was a frontiersman, and the former indentured servants went to him to try to get him to talk to the governor of Virginia because he was related to the governor of Virginia by marriage. So the frontier settlers attacked nearby native villages, which happened to be allies of the English, but to frontiersmen, all the natives look alike. Well, obviously the natives attacked the frontiersmen back. The governor of Virginia, Sir William Berkeley, refused to intervene, so Bacon formed a militia of planters, frontiersmen, and laborers, both black and white, to attack natives regardless of their affiliation. So this was an unusual interracial coalition based solely on class. I mean, I know when you think of, well, a planter, it means like a plantation owner. But usually that's rich folks. But at this time, it was still just farmers that happened to have a little bit of land. But yeah, this was class solidarity. These were laborers and farmers working together. And while they were still attacking natives, this was specifically going against Berkeley, who declared Bacon guilty of treason and demanded that he and his men come to Jamestown to stand trial. Instead, Bacon and his men began heading towards Jamestown and burning plantations along the way. Meanwhile, in Jamestown, the, quote, newswives of the men in the plantations, or in the militia, were spreading rumors about the mistreatment of the workers, and by the time Bacon and his men even got to Jamestown, the general population of Jamestown were on the side of Nathaniel Bacon, and the House of Burgesses was essentially under the control of Bacon's sympathizers. So he not only had a militia and was like burning down Berkeley's stuff, including Berkeley's plantation, he had won like a political victory over the House of Burgesses. By the time he got to Jamestown, though, Berkeley fled across the Chesapeake Bay to not get captured by this militia that was after his head. Bacon and his men did burn down Jamestown as a show of force, but then a month later, Bacon was dead of dysentery because it's the 1600s, and that just happens. The movement was crushed. Landowners who worked with him had their plantations plundered. But the biggest part of this, besides the fact that we almost had like a class war uprising that almost won in the 1600s, is that Berkeley saw that disenfranchised white laborers were willing to work with their black counterparts. And we can't have that because racism. So he allowed the white rebels to return home peacefully made their lot in life a little bit better, gave them a little bit more land, a little bit more money, but cracked down on the black rebels to further divide things along racial lines. And, that's how class warfare works, is the upper class tries to keep the lower class divided, but I'm not going to get into that. King Charles II also chartered the Royal African Company in 1672 to carry African slaves to North America, so the English didn't have to rely on the Dutch anymore. So now England/America is fully in the slave trade. So, and here we have your typical laborers. I believe this one's actually European. We didn't see a whole lot of grain in this region of North America. But the whole family would be involved. You had the father, the mother, the older children, and also, like, even the baby, you just stick them in a tree because you can't leave them in the house. They'll burn the place down. We all know toddlers are pyromaniacs. Here we have Jamestown, fairly prosperous little trading town at this point. Here we have a plantation being burned to the ground by Bacon and his boys. Another really good image here. Almanac. All right. And one more thing before we get to the next section is the West Indies. So, tobacco was making plenty of money, but English investors, or European investors regardless, understood that they needed to diversify their crop portfolio in order to be prepared for when eventually tobacco prices drop, because they would, because that's how it always works, which is weird that in the 1600s they were aware of that, but in like the 1800s, like 2/3 of America's economy was cotton, and nobody thought, maybe we should do something besides cotton. But, whatever. So, in the West Indies, the English, Dutch, and French had colonies. As we mentioned, obviously the Spanish had a few of theirs as well, but most of that was in like mainland Mexico and South America. So the English had permanent settlements on St. Christopher, Barbados, Nevis. Barbados was the most prominent. It was used to raise tobacco, cotton, and livestock. The Dutch had St. Martin and Curacao. Though mostly they were a shipping colony shipping empire for other colonies. We'll get into that later. The French had Guadeloupe, Martinique, and eventually Saint-Dominique, which would eventually become Haiti. However, apparently, all the islands they found were full of natives that did not want them there, so the French were not able to exploit the islands the way the English did. So, we've discussed that tobacco is the big crop up in North America. What was the big moneymaker for the Caribbean islands? Yes, the Sugar Islands, as they were known. Tobacco prices stagnated, and some planters had already begun looking at sugarcane in the Caribbean to be ready for that, and that was where the money was made. We'd already briefly mentioned sugarcane already with Barbados, but in case you guys have forgotten, yes, sugar. As I mentioned, though, sugar was really tough to grow and manufacture. Expensive equipment, technical know-how, lots of labor, and it had to be shipped back to Europe for final refinement. So it was the Dutch that actually had this technical know-how and the refineries, while the English had the land for it. So it was Barbados that became the big sugar plantation island. And this would greatly shift how the economic and political landscape of the Caribbean would become, as well as North America as a whole. So land and labor would continue to increase in competition between the various European powers, and then, of course, dealing with the natives that were there and didn't want the Europeans there, and the increased need for slave labor. So the Dutch had learned about sugarcane cultivation from the Portuguese in Brazil, had the best refineries in Europe, but as I said, they didn't have the colony space, which the English did. And as a side note, which I mentioned in a later slide, South Carolina actually wasn't settled by like an English explorer from, I mean, it was settled by an English explorer, but they didn't leave from England and like check out the South Carolina coast. It was groups from Barbados who were traveling up the North American coast and were like, hey, these gross, awful, swampy lowlands are like the islands down in the Caribbean. We can grow stuff here. So South Carolina was actually settled as a colony of Barbados to continue growing sugar and rice and indigo, actually. Cotton came again later due to various things we'll get into later. So yeah, well, I say South Carolina. It was the southern part of what would become the Carolinas that would eventually become South Carolina. But I'm being pedantic. So here's the Caribbean. I'm so used to very specific color coding for the nations. I'm not used to seeing England in not red. It's like England doesn't have all that land. It's like, all right, that's Spain. So Spain has, obviously all of this. I guess they didn't use Cuba for much. I mean, they had a lot of land here. The French, again, Saint Dominique, as well as, some islands here. The English had Jamaica, the Bahamas, and again, specifically Barbados. Barbados, I guess, was just a really good island for growing stuff, despite it not being particularly large. Whereas the Dutch had, what, Curacao, was it? No, that was the, what did it say the Dutch had? Yeah, St. Martin and Curacao. So yeah, they had, like, just a little bit. But their main thing was they had a really big fleet because they weren't fighting the English, so they could, sail around and do shipping for everybody. They were 1600s FedEx. So growing sugar was a pain in the ass. Harvesting sugar was a pain in the ass. I mean, if you've ever seen sugar cane, it's just like this massive reed, essentially, that you had to cut with machetes, and then you'd grind it up using these grind wheels, and then pour it into what were basically boiling vats. If you got that stuff on you, it would burn to the bone. Like, this stuff was like, it was essentially molten. And if it stuck to you, you could jump in water and it wouldn't stop. It would just keep burning. So a lot of the laborers for these sugar plantations would have horrible burns on their arms and face from this stuff splashing on them. if it didn't kill them outright. So again, here we have like wind-powered, the grinders. Got a couple of images of these. Here's one that's powered by like a donkey that's just going around and grinding the sugar cane up into the more, not really refined sugar, but the powder version, and then going down here to boil. And here again, it's just the other versions of it. You've got the like manual kind, and also a water wheel. And here we have, England down to Barbados, and then up to Charlestown and Jamestown in Bermuda, and then back to England. Okay, before we get to the next section, I'm going to ask you guys another question. What two things could they refine out of sugar? Like sugarcane sugar in the Mediterranean, not Mediterranean, the Caribbean. What two products could they make from that? Well, which is to say, one of them is the sugar being refined, and then they refine that product further into something else.
Is it something that we still use today?
Yes. Not a lot, but you can still get it. Not sugar cubes. Not that refined. This is still like sugar cane sugar. Don't think like modern white sugar. This is like ground up brown sugar. Think like old-timey prospector days is the only thing I can think of. What's that?
Is it molasses?
Yes, molasses. Yeah, that was part of what boiling it would do, would be turning it into molasses. And there's other refinement processes, they put stuff in it. But they turn it into molasses, which was really good because it would keep longer. And molasses is really sweet. If you've ever had molasses, it's like almost too sweet. And it was good for all sorts of things. And then you would refine molasses further. Do you know what you can make out of molasses? Well, molasses was usually the syrup.
So like caramel?
Yes, but I'm thinking beyond that. And I'll give you a hint. They would ferment molasses. Yes. Rum is fermented molasses. So yeah, this was really important in the Caribbean. When you think Caribbean and the pirates and stuff, it's like, oh yeah, rum. This is where it all comes from. So yeah, there was a lot of money to be made. We'll actually discuss molasses and rum here in just a little bit. So let's head north. So the Virginia Company was making plenty of money with, all the tobacco, but they figured, hey, we can make money by just like selling land we don't own to people that want to travel across the Atlantic. So yeah, anybody that could afford a legal charter, they'd sell it to them, and they could go overseas and set up their own little colony. So a group of English pilgrims on a separatist wanted to form a separate church and community away from Catholics, Anglicans, and just Europe in general. They felt like their children were being corrupted by the Catholics and Anglicans and blah-de-blah-de-blah. So they would go overseas and start over in the New World. So they left from Plymouth, England, on the Mayflower, which it was not a big ship. September 1620, both English and Dutch pilgrims. Again, the word pilgrim does not mean people who came to America from England. Pilgrim is anybody who travels for like a religious reason, and for them it was like leaving England to come to North America for religious reasons. Pilgrim is more of like a medieval term, actually, for like people that would go on pilgrimages to various holy sites. This is one of the last times that word is used. But again, when people only learn American history, that's the only time they hear this word. And it's like, oh, the Pilgrims are the ones that came on the Mayflower. It's like, I mean, technically, yeah, but that's not the only meaning of the word. However, the Atlantic tends to be stormy. I see they left in September. Yeah, that's hurricane season. So they ended up in Cape Cod, Massachusetts instead in December. Good God, September, October, November. They were on the ocean for several months. And they arrived in Massachusetts in December. Now the book says, with winter rapidly descending, if you're in Massachusetts in December, it's already winter. So they were just like, screw it, we gotta start now. We gotta just do our thing here because we're not going anywhere. But before they got out and attempted to settle, they signed the Mayflower Compact, led by William Bradford, who was in charge of the whole ordeal, which was the first written constitution in North America, due to the Pilgrims technically having landed outside of where they were supposed to settle. So technically they were like illegally squatting in what would become Massachusetts. But like none of the European powers had really claimed that area yet, so they found a village with cornfields that happened to be uninhabited, and then they set up their new home that they named Plymouth after the city they had just came from. You would think that a group calling themselves separatists, and they wanted to separate from everything in England, would have named their new settlement something else. I don't know. You'd think if you're crammed in a ship for 3 months, you'd have thought of a different name for your settlement when you get there, but I don't. Whatever. However, they saw some natives in the area and quickly built a fort because, oh no, natives are going to get us. However, the natives were not going to get them because a smallpox epidemic had swept through the area and killed about 90% of them. Because, as I mentioned, the Europeans had already been traipsing through the area, and they don't have to stick around to spread smallpox. So there weren't many natives left to give the Pilgrims any grief. That said, by spring of 1621, only about half of the Pilgrims who had landed were left because winter in Massachusetts sucks, and also like they started building their settlement in December. So it was a rough time was had by all. But I hate to say it, 50% casualties is still a whole lot better than what Jamestown had been doing. So, we were looking at 90% plus casualties down in Jamestown. So here we have the Mayflower. Again, it's not very big. When you see a sailing ship, they look big, but most of it's the sails. If you look at the actual part that the people are on, like here's some dudes standing on top. This was the captain's cabin, so this actually isn't a lot of room that people actually use. It's mostly this deck, and that's essentially like one floor. And as you can see from the width, that's smaller than this room, essentially. And then below that is like ballast area and stuff, and you don't want to be down there. That area is gross. And, then there's this. I'm hoping it wasn't this bad, but there's a good chance it was this bad. And also, on the inside, it was really freaking cramped. You couldn't build again, areas like this room with lots of open space. You had to build them nice and strong due to the previous issues. So yeah, that was 3 months in that. Yeah, it was good times. There's Plymouth. Pretty good little settlement for not a very large group of people putting it together. So they were approached by English-speaking natives, Somerset and Squanto, who had been captured by some English explorers beforehand and then were released, and so they knew how to speak English. Brokered a fragile peace with Chief Massasoit of the Wampanoag tribe. And again, Massasoit realized, hey, these Europeans have guns. Let's make friends with them, help them not die, and they'll give us guns. Because, again, the natives were constantly fighting each other, like the Europeans were constantly fighting each other. So if you've got this group that comes from outside that has all this power, make friends with them so they'll give you some of their power. So by summer of 1621, the Pilgrims had regained their health. Fresh supply ship arrived, and a charter came in 1622 that legitimized Plymouth Plantation. So they had some degree of self-government. This is, again, a bit different from Jamestown. Also different from Jamestown is they're not sitting in the middle of a mosquito and disease-infested swamp. Due to it being colder, there was less disease, which made it so that they weren't constantly dying. Now that said, this did encourage the Pilgrims to immediately become more aggressive against the natives, or at least those who were opposing them, such as the Massachusetts tribe. So, at least in New England, the English settlers sort of took a French approach where they came in, they allied with the natives nearby, and then they worked with those natives against their rivals. So, Miles Standish, working with the Wampanoag tribe, attacked and killed the chief of the Massachusetts tribe and a lot of its people, thus scattering many of them north and west, which further alerted tribes to, hey, there's some crazy people with tall hats that are like murdering us, which we'll actually get to more when we talk about the Puritans. Now, the Dutch separatists weren't too keen on this approach, but it did make the Wampanoag tribe and Massasoit specifically as chief the most powerful native group in the region. So again, a bit more like the French, where they are attacking natives but working with other native groups rather than just attacking everybody like the folks down in Jamestown were doing, or like the Spanish had been doing. So we have Somerset or Squanto, I'm not sure which one it is. It's like, oh, I'm scared, there's a man here. Here's Plymouth, 1622. Pretty nice little seaside town. There's Standish and his boys going out to fight the Massachusetts. Again, the natives were very aware of how to use guns. And here's Miles Standish being the hero. He's about to nail a dude to a wall. Yeah, the only thing I remember about Miles Standish from my high school education was, oh yeah, he was this great hero of the Pilgrims. Not, oh yeah, he got off slaughtering natives. Yeah, Standish was a bit of a dick. The next section is about Puritans, and there's a lot to that, so we'll save that for, I guess, next week. Yeah, because there's a lot to, because, I mean, we got the Puritan migration, but then there's, like, the Puritan worldview, and those opposing the Puritans, and all of that. So, yeah, we'll get into that next week. Because today's Wednesday, right? Yeah.